what we're doing here is building yet another one. That cross performance build blew up. It didn't take long. And I think what the goal is at this point is it's pretty easy to get one of these to run for, you know, the kind of user like myself. I've got a few years on them. And of course there's been changes in the parts, and that plays into it somewhat. But I want to see if I can get one of these to last in a true loggers environment. And the fellow I have running them is probably the toughest person I've ever seen on saws. And interestingly enough, out of the 3 Farmertec 660s that he's experienced, the only one that did not blow up is my Farmer Jones build. And I think I did a video on that quite a while back, probably, well, at least a year or so. And of course I would have thought that would have been the first one to go. But no, it still goes, still runs. And I knew I had hurt the top end just a little bit, did a little bit of a cold seize. And he did blow it up. He wants it back. Sometimes I wonder if the poor cross performance is suffering from a person who really doesn't want that saw. He wants the Farmer Jones. But I don't know, about this time last year there were some cranks that I think were bad. And I've had 2 of them come apart. So I guess that's one thing to check for. You guys getting the kits now, I don't think you're going to have a problem. But you guys who have kits from that period of time, you do want to take the extra time. I found a different crank to use from Greece. It's an aftermarket one sold for that fella, starts with a D, on eBay from Greece. I want to get a couple of those and see if that helps. But what I'm going to do today is I've already built one, got it running, but I'm going to build 2 and leave them pretty much as the parts come out of the box and see if they can survive. The saw that he took was tuned probably at 75-80 degrees, and it came apart or locked up, as he said, on Friday, and Friday was 10 degrees. So from the time that it left here to the time it got out in the field, there was a 70-degree drop in temperature, ambient temperature. I haven't seen the saw yet, so you're always in that mode of, oh my God, what could have broken? Of course I expect things to go apart. That was one that had the crank go apart, and I just took as many of the used pieces as I could and put it back together, and wanted to see whether or not those parts that had gone through that first wreck were going to survive. And you know, maybe that's one of the things that could have failed, was maybe that top end had been damaged, a piston or something like that, and I'm going to find out. But back to this build, I do use 1184 with these gaskets. Always make sure these pins are on the flywheel side. Just make sure there's a little bit of oil on that bearing and in that, just a little bit. But what I was doing on the PTO side, I'd back it off just a little bit, just back things off, and then I would turn the crank, you know, kind of like that. Then I'd go back up and give it another couple of turns. Back it off, you know, then turn the crank a little bit. So as that seal was getting to that sharp edge on the crank, it was turning and would help work its way through. But a lot of them have a little bit more of a blunt lip, and then they just poke right through. Boy, that just makes it so much easier. I'm going to give it just a little bit of a tug.
Explores the ups and downs of 3 pregnant teens. Parents and grandparents must step in and help them through this huge life change.
That's perfect. That seal laid in there just perfectly. And spin it by your fingers. There's a little oil everywhere. I saw one guy taking, oh, it spins and it keeps going. Well, if you don't have seal pressure on your crank, maybe before the seals, if you don't have seal friction, that means you're going to have a pretty leaky bottom end. So no, don't expect it to go this and keep spinning. It has to be a little bit of tension from the seals. That's actually quite good. So I'm going to set the case bolts in there, or case screws, and crank this one tight and start building this on. So we're getting several updates from these people. The way the oil pumps are coming through now, you don't need that little rubber piece anymore on the end, and the worm gear is coming assembled. So that's yet another upgrade. So we're looking at several upgrades. Cylinder, the relieved side covers, that's an upgrade. The oil pump, we'll see how it lasts, but not having to put that rubber piece in there, and having the worm gear already assembled, that's an upgrade. The carburetors, so things are progressing, you know what I'm saying? Another place that I've actually seen some improvements is the roundness of the clutch drums. They've definitely changed. They've definitely changed the components on the chain adjusters. So again, to those people who are working with the Farmertec parts, trust me when I tell you, they're actually going through, you know, a working process. It's upgrades. And lest anyone get all bent out of shape about that, there isn't a saw company in the world that doesn't take a product and move it forward. And that's really all they're doing. They're just taking their product line and moving it forward and advancing it as time goes on. Now, putting the oil line in, you can argue that it's easier to do that before you put the cases together, because it has to have that lip get to both sides of the case. I don't know. I just stuff it in there. These are the little rubber grommets. They go right there. And basically that seals there. This goes into the pickup tube, and this squeezes on that rubber grommet. Alright, moving on. So here's your oil pump. You got to remember the little grommet plus the pickup tube and filter goes into the tank. Well, here we go again, having to modify things. This little guy is too long. It won't go down the cases. Nothing like a die grinder. Solves so many problems. So it looks like there was a little bit of a burr at the end that just had to get cleaned up. So there's that. With grease on that. Alright, it's now shimmed. Let's see if that makes a difference. We'll just see how that works. By the way, for those who are asking, right there, that piece right there, that's the vent that goes into your bar oil tank. A lot of times you'll see a little oil leak out of there too on other brands. Okay, I'm going to cover a lot of ground here in a hurry, but I've got to do a little bit of a swirl so I can really show you how to do the chain brake. And before I do the chain brake stuff, I really need to get the handle on and my cylinder on. Get the handle on before I go after putting on the chain brake. So, get the handle on. A couple things you got to do. First thing is this little bumper right here. It's a lot easier being able to get to it if you can get through the hole before you put the rubber bumpers in there. And it goes right down here in the corner. And being yet again another fine threaded screw, you don't want to tighten that too tight, just make it firm. That goes there. Pantene works really good as a lubricant on these darn things. That one's in there. Don't get too enthusiastic. So you get the 4 bumpers in there. Pulse line right there. Just stuff it right on there. And just a little bit of Pantene. So after you get those rubber bumpers in there, you got to put this anti-vibe on right here. You need a shorter, I guess they're around like 15 millimeter long, but they're a little shorter than the other screws because they only have to get to that, you know what I'm saying? So I had to rob these out of spare parts bin. Once you get that on there, you're a little bit confined by geometry, you know. Pretty much have to work your way in that way. Make sure you don't trap your kill switch wires. And it just kind of goes in just kind of like that. You know, you just sort of push it together. Make them go firm. I think one of the things that's happened to me is because of these aftermarket part saws, you know, you can basically build a saw complete from aftermarket parts. I'm actually getting interested in the originals. It's quite obvious to me that this was a really, 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 really rugged design. And yeah, like my modern 562s and all that, these damn things are just cool. You know what I'm saying? There's a cool factor to these older steels that's really, really hard to quantify. It makes sense to put this rubber thing on about now. You know, because really you don't have a whole lot of access when the cylinder's on. So you put that on now. Also makes sense while you have all this. It makes sense to put that on there because you have access to it. It also makes sense to pull that through right about now. The pulse line kind of comes right through there. You don't have to be gentle with that. You just grab a pair of pliers and yank that thing right through. Kind of goes pop, comes right through. I'll put these on next. They too benefit from a little bit of lubrication. You kind of need to hurry because the temperature is dropping very rapidly. I've been having a salamander heater on pretty much all day. It's pretty chilly outside. And if I don't get these on PDQ, rubber's already beginning to get a little more. You know, there's not a lot of advantages to being overweight, but putting on these steel caps is one. There we go. So, got the handle on, rubber bumpers in, that little bushing right there, plastic screws, plastic caps, pulse line come through. This anti-vibe needs one of the shorter screws. I may have to go get a cup of coffee and warm up. Time to get the cylinder on. Now what I do, especially on these, is wipe them down. Alright, wipe them down. There's like a machining residue from when they did the honing that's still in there. And if you see it for the first time, it looks like it just looks like dirt, because that's what it is. But I believe it's residue from the abrasive. And I really do think it makes sense to take the time to wash the cylinder. Make sure at least at a minimum you wipe that stuff out of there. You know, exhaust port's pretty symmetric, and if you notice, it's got a nice curvature at the top. Let's see if you can see it from that angle. That's not going to snag a ring. Transfers are bigger than they used to be. So is the exhaust. I mean, this is definitely an improvement. I don't know if it's going to hold up, but from a geometric standpoint, you know, what it appears to be on the plating side, that's a huge improvement over what was there before. This is a big improvement. I've got one where that's pretty off center. You know, I could hit that, I guess, with a die grinder. Yeah, maybe I'll do that. That's a little better. By the way, one of the things I do on my die grinders is I put a little nut and bolt arrangement where I can adjust how far I can make it, make this go down, so I don't overspeed them. You need to have the RPMs down, or they just fill right up with aluminum on this cheaper material. You know, if you run that bit too fast, it just gums up instantaneously. I'm not worried about that chip because of where it is. The piston skirt will never get to it. You know, the piston will never get to that. You know, because that's where the piston comes down to out there. So I'm not worried about that little chip there. The rest of the bore looks okay. You know, I made that just symmetric. That's all I did. I don't mind having a little roughness down there. There's no sense in going smooth. A lot of guys get into this concept of porting and polishing. Well, the polishing is kind of a waste of time. You need a little bit of roughness. And that's fluid dynamic theory, because you don't want what's called laminar flow, where the fluid, or air in this case, starts at zero at the wall and then shears until it gets maximum velocity at the center of the port. You want to break that surface tension right at the wall, where there's a little turbulence right at the wall of what you're flowing through. In this case, the intake port. And it acts like ball bearing, so it goes from zero to very rapidly max velocity if there's a little turbulence right along the edge of the wall. I don't know if I'll put that in the video. How is that? That crank feels so much better than the other ones I've used. And that cylinder is a lot better. I'm feeling a lot better about that. So now, before I put the cylinder on, two things. One, I'm not going to bother checking squish and all that. We're just going to put it together as it came. But I need to put the intake boot on first. You know. By the way, should you question what I said about having a little bit of turbulence at the wall actually increases the ability to flow, If you question that, ask yourself how come Steel and a whole bunch of other companies put these little dimples on the walls of their intake boots. Husky's no different. Get that right in there. Make sure that little arrow points right along the seam. Doesn't have perfect, but also I have the cylinder out. Just got it cleaned up. Husky decomp, I'm just going to stick right in there for now. That's a pretty low grade aluminum, and there's not a lot of thread engagement. So this is another place where you really don't want to go crazy tightening things, you know. I found it's best to have the tightening screw on the PTO side, which by the way is why it's a lot better to do it here than when it's actually on the saw. And this is another one where you got to be a little bit objective. You don't want to go too crazy tight on this thing. It's not like the Huskies where they've engineered it to where you can only get so tight with a little bushing. These, you can go so tight that you actually squeeze that intake right off or cut it. So you get down there, you know, where there's about somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 inch where it's firm, and that's it. Leave it. Don't go any further. Okay, cylinder's ready to go on, but I need to get the piston on. So let's do that next. And with the piston, like with all the saws, the arrow points to the exhaust, so that's going to go that way. And since it's easier to put the wrist pin in from this side, I'll put the wrist pin clip on this side first, push the wrist pin through, and then clip on second on that side. So I couldn't help myself. I had to chop these down just a little bit. So let me take the shorter one. Where was I? Oh, that's going to the exhaust, which means I want that side. You got to put that gasket in there before you put the piston on. A little bit of oil on the bearing. Let me get that piston warmed up just a little bit. It makes it a lot easier for the wrist pin to get through. Look at that, just slides right through now. Look at that. Alright, that's in there. Alright. Let's get the cylinder right on there. One thing you need to do is you need to get the cylinder bolts on before you think about getting that cylinder down in there, because once it's down in there it's really hard to get the cylinder screws in there. So you kind of get that cylinder down, and as I have said a bunch of times, you want to be down at bottom dead center before you start cranking in those screws. Let me put a flywheel on so I can turn, make sure everything's turning freely. keyway right there. Yeah, don't let me forget. Put that on. So let me. Feels nice and free. So I'll start cranking this down then. If the skirt's interfering with the crank a little bit, or if the gasket is squeezed out and interfered with the piston a little bit, you know, things like that will make the piston bind at bottom dead center. That's definitely an improved cylinder, no doubt. And it's interesting because the piston, when it gets to bottom dead center, is dead on the floor of the exhaust port, you know. Little things like that. And I did not check squish, and on this saw I really don't care what the squish is, you know. Just want it to run. Not getting a whole lot more out of them. Alright, let's see where we are now. Yeah, everything's smooth. So we're good. So let me just go ahead and put the muffler on, and then I can go back and address the chain brake, and then I'll go finish off the saw. I need muffler gasket. I need the bolts, screws for the muffler, and I need a muffler. Okay. The way this gig works is you've got to get these two into the cylinder with the gasket first. Okay? And they come in a packet like this, where you have the two little short ones on for the top, the heavier 6mm ones for the bottom, and then the 5s that go into the cylinder. So there's 6 screws. Sometimes it can be a little bit of a trick to get that on there. Now, again, one of the little things that I do is before I wind those down, is I take these larger ones and just set them in the bottom. I'm going to take them back out because, of course, you have to. But get those in, and basically what that does is when you cinch up the ones in the cylinder, you're not taking these off the center line of the holes that they have to go back into later. So I just kind of run them in like that. Then I come back up here and crank down those. You got to remember, you got to crush that gasket. But you don't really want to. Strip them out, you know. There's a point of diminishing returns with these things. They rattle out. So after you've built one of these and got some time on it, checking things over, it's a good idea to pull the face of the muffler off and get in there and tighten up those screws. I've For that matter, almost every one I've ever built has those. Alright. Just right in there. Before you get crazy tightening those down there, make sure you get these up here started. Yeah, I get those pretty tight. So there's your top end and the bottom end. And everything is turning nice and free. I don't feel anything hanging up anywhere. Okay. By the way, when you tighten up the flywheel nut, take that flywheel and rotate it as far forward as it will go in that keyway. And what you've done is you've just advanced your timing just a little bit. You know, it actually makes a difference. You make it run a little bit better. As far as torque on these things, I don't know, 25 to 28 foot-pounds, or a couple rattles with an air wrench, your choice. It's your saw. All right, the reason I went through the squirrel is I want to be able to show you how to do the chain brake, because that's one area I think is kind of left a little bit not as well defined as it should be.